A janitor's secret notebook shocks a multi-billion-dollar company. This will cost them millions. What is he planning? It was the kind of silence that didn't belong in a building like Echelon Innovations. At 10 p.m., the world's largest tech company should have buzzed with the hum of late-night brainstorming sessions or the soft clatter of keyboards. Instead, the only sound was the faint squeak of a mop as Tom Grayson worked his way down a long hallway of glass-walled offices. Tom moved with practiced efficiency, blending into the reflective surfaces and corporate sterility. The executives who occupied these offices during the day rarely noticed him. That was the point. A janitor's job wasn't just to clean, it was to stay invisible. And Tom did his job well, but invisibility came with advantages. Tom saw everything. Tonight was no different. Through the frosted glass of the conference room, he glimpsed a hurried executive pacing on a phone call. The words were muffled, but the tension was obvious. If we can't lock this deal in 2 weeks, we're done. Tom's mop paused mid-stroke. His gaze shifted to the papers scattered across the conference table. A single glance was enough to tell him something wasn't adding up. He didn't need to know every detail to spot the cracks in their strategy. He resumed mopping, quietly observing. Once the executive left, Tom slipped into the conference room. His movements were calm, deliberate. He scanned the papers, his trained eye zeroing in on the highlighted sections and the numbers that didn't quite line up. A frown crossed his face as he picked up a printout detailing the company's upcoming presentation. Projected growth rates, exaggerated, he muttered under his breath. His voice was low, thoughtful. He folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket before heading back to his cart. Later, during his break, Tom sat in the dimly lit janitor's closet. From his pocket, he pulled a tattered leather-bound notebook. Its edges were frayed, and the cover bore the faint smudges of a working man's hands. He flipped to a fresh page, took a pen from behind his ear, and began to write. Projected Q3 revenue inflated by 30%. If they present this to investors, it'll crumble under scrutiny. No contingency plan for tech bottlenecks in development pipeline? He stopped writing, tapping the pen against his lips as he thought. Then he added another note. They're building on sand. This will cost them millions if they don't pivot. The notebook snapped shut, and Tom tucked it into his pocket. His shift wasn't over, and he had no intention of drawing attention to himself. He'd learned long ago that people rarely listen to quiet voices, especially those carrying mops. As he returned to his rounds, Tom passed a group of junior employees huddled near the vending machine, whispering about rumors of layoffs. He caught a few words. Investors. Numbers don't make sense. What happens if it fails? Tom didn't stop, but a small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. No one noticed the janitor, but the janitor noticed everything. Would you ever suspect the quietest person in the room of holding the most valuable insights? Tom's shifts were repetitive, almost meditative, but his mind was far from idle. As he pushed his cart through the gleaming hallways, his thoughts wandered to the papers he'd read in the conference room. The numbers bothered him, but it wasn't just about the company's financial future. It was the arrogance of it all, the blind confidence that no one would question the flaws in their projections. Later that night, in the solitude of his studio apartment, Tom pulled the printout from his jacket and spread it on the small dining table. He skimmed the key points again, his brows furrowing deeper with each line. Years ago, he would have been the one creating these reports. Now he was the one cleaning up after the people who did. He couldn't decide which was worse, the numbers on the page or the memory of his own fall from grace. Tom opened his notebook and started writing. Their projected app launch timeline is unrealistic. Development delays from the last quarter aren't accounted for. If they miss deadlines, investors will panic. The pen paused as he stared at the page. Was this just an exercise in futility? Who would listen to a janitor? The next day, Tom's observations became more deliberate. He lingered a little longer near the break rooms, catching snippets of conversations from stressed employees. Phrases like logistics nightmare and can't make the tech work painted a picture of disarray beneath the company's polished exterior. That evening, during his usual rounds, Tom overheard a heated exchange between two executives in the corner of an empty lobby. I'm telling you, the pitch isn't ready, one of them said, his voice low but sharp. The investors are going to tear us apart. We don't have a choice, the other snapped. We'll patch it together. Just make sure it looks good on paper. Tom pretended to wipe the glass walls as their words lingered in his ears. The phrase "looks good on paper" struck a nerve. He'd seen this before. Polished presentations built on shaky foundations. It was always the same story. People in power ignoring the cracks until it was too late. As the executives walked away, Tom's hand instinctively moved to the notebook in his pocket. He didn't pull it out, but the urge to act was growing stronger. He wasn't sure what he could do, but he couldn't just watch this train wreck unfold. At home that night, Tom sat at his table, staring at the growing list of observations in his notebook. Each point felt like a piece of a puzzle only he could see. He scribbled a question in the margin. If no one else fixes it, should I? He thought about the executives who ignored him, the employees who barely noticed him, the endless nights spent cleaning up after people who never even learned his name. Did he owe them anything? Was it worth the risk to speak up? Tom closed the notebook, letting out a long breath. He didn't have an answer yet, but something told him he wasn't going to stay silent for much longer. Have you ever felt like you held the answer to a problem no one else could see? What would you do? It was just another night shift, or at least that's how it started. Tom's routine was as predictable as the corporate machine itself. The empty hallways, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the faint scent of freshly cleaned floors all blended into the background of his thoughts. But tonight, something changed. As he cleaned the executive conference room, Tom's gaze fell on a notebook left open on the table. It was filled with the familiar bold handwriting of Rachel Hughes, a young VP known for her ambition and razor-sharp wit. The pages detailed the framework of the company's upcoming investor pitch. Tom couldn't help himself. His eyes skimmed the notes, quickly spotting glaring gaps and miscalculations. The timeline for the tech launch was grossly optimistic. Revenue projections didn't account for market fluctuations. The plan leaned heavily on untested strategies. It wasn't just flawed, it was reckless. He stared at the notebook, torn. Part of him wanted to leave it alone, to keep his head down and his life simple. But his hands betrayed him. He pulled out his own notebook, jotted down key points, and tucked it away just as Rachel walked in. Rachel stopped short, surprised to see Tom still in the room. "Burning the midnight oil?" she joked, her tone light but distracted. Tom smiled faintly, stepping back toward his cart. "Just finishing up." But as he pushed the cart out, Rachel's eyes fell on something. A corner of his notebook sticking out of his pocket. She didn't say anything, but her curiosity was piqued. The next day, Tom left his notebook on the break room table, thinking nothing of it. He had paused mid-writing to grab coffee from the vending machine, and in those few minutes, fate intervened. Rachel walked in, her sharp eyes immediately catching sight of the worn cover and scattered notes. She flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she read the detailed observations and solutions Tom had written about the company's inefficiencies. When Tom returned, Rachel was still there, holding the notebook. Her gaze was sharp but not unkind. "This is yours?" she asked, lifting it slightly. Tom hesitated. "It's just some thoughts." "Some thoughts?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "These thoughts are more detailed than our team reports." "How do you know all this?" Tom shrugged, his expression guarded. "You notice things when you're invisible." Rachel studied him for a moment, then held out the notebook. "This could fix a lot of what's broken here. You know that, right?" Tom took the notebook carefully, unsure of her angle. "No one's going to listen to a janitor." Rachel smirked. "Maybe not, but they'll listen to me." The next night, Rachel approached Tom again, this time holding a copy of the investor pitch presentation. "I need your help," she said, her voice low. "This presentation is a disaster, and the clock's ticking. You've clearly thought about this more than anyone else. Will you let me use your ideas?" Tom frowned, instinctively pulling back. "And when it works, who gets the credit?" "Not me." Rachel's expression softened. "I won't pretend the system's fair, but right now it's not about credit. It's about saving the company. I'll make sure your ideas are heard, even if no one knows they're yours." Tom stared at her, conflicted. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, but if this goes sideways, don't bring my name into it." Rachel smiled. "Deal." Over the next few days, Rachel quietly overhauled the pitch using Tom's insights. Every time she presented a new draft to the board, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The plan was no longer a desperate gamble. It was a carefully crafted strategy with a real chance of success. On the eve of the presentation, Tom stood outside the conference room, listening as Rachel rehearsed. One executive asked, "Where did these ideas come from?" Rachel paused, her eyes briefly flickering toward the hallway where Tom stood. She smiled faintly and replied, "Let's just say it came from someone who knows this company better than we think." The day of the investor presentation arrived, and the air at Echelon Innovations was thick with tension. The executives were gathered in the sleek, glass-walled conference room, their tailored suits and confident expressions masking a growing sense of unease. This pitch would determine the future of the company, and everyone knew it. Tom stood in the corner of the room, inconspicuous as ever. He had been asked to handle final preparations, which conveniently allowed him to observe the unfolding drama. Rachel entered, her usual confident stride now tempered with an edge of nerves. She carried the finalized presentation, a blueprint forged from Tom's notebook, and placed it on the table. As the investors arrived, the atmosphere shifted. These weren't ordinary attendees. They were some of the most influential figures in the industry, with the power to either save or sink Echelon. Tom watched as Rachel began her presentation, her voice steady and poised. She walked the room through the revised strategy, highlighting practical solutions and realistic projections. The investors seemed intrigued, nodding at key points. But the room's energy shifted when one of them, an older man with a sharp gaze, raised a hand. "Your timeline for the product launch assumes no delays. That's optimistic, given your history." Rachel hesitated, glancing briefly at Tom. The room grew tense, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Tom's pulse quickened. She wasn't prepared for this question. It hadn't come up during rehearsals. Finally, Rachel spoke. "You're right, it's a valid concern, and we've considered contingency plans to address potential delays." "Such as?" the investor pressed, his tone challenging. Rachel faltered. The other executives exchanged nervous glances, sensing the momentum slipping away. In the corner, Tom clenched his fists. He didn't want to get involved. This wasn't his fight. But as he saw Rachel struggling, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. All eyes turned toward him, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright shock. The room went silent as Tom walked toward the table, the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. Rachel's eyes widened. "Tom!" He held up a hand to stop her and addressed the investor directly. "The contingency involves reallocating resources from non-essential projects to fast-track development in case of delays. We've also accounted for additional testing phases to ensure quality without compromising the timeline." The investor raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Tom Grayson," he said simply. "I've been working here for 10 years. You probably know me as the janitor." The room erupted into murmurs, disbelief rippling through the group. One executive blurted out, "What is he doing here?" Tom met the man's gaze evenly. "I'm here because I've been watching this company run itself into the ground while pretending everything's fine. I've seen the inefficiencies, the waste, and the missed opportunities, and I've been writing them down." He pulled his tattered notebook from his pocket and placed it on the table. "Everything you need to save this company is in here. You can ignore me if you want, but you can't ignore the truth." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the investor who had challenged Rachel picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. His expression shifted from skepticism to intrigue as he read Tom's meticulous notes. "This," he began, looking up. "This is incredible. Why hasn't any of this been addressed before?" Tom shrugged. "Because no one listens to the quiet voices. But sometimes the quiet voices are the ones paying the most attention." The presentation continued, with Rachel seamlessly integrating Tom's explanations. The investors, once wary, now seemed engaged, even impressed. By the end, they were nodding in approval, their earlier doubts replaced with cautious optimism. As the investors left, the CEO turned to Rachel and Tom, his expression unreadable. "This was unexpected," he said, "but effective. We'll be discussing this further." Later, as Rachel and Tom walked back to the office, she glanced at him. You didn't have to do that, Tom smirked. Yes, I did. What happens now? She asked. Tom's smile faded slightly as he looked down at his notebook. That depends. Are they willing to listen, or is this just another cleanup job? The days following the presentation were a whirlwind of activity and uncertainty. The investors had approved the funding, but the buzz within Echelon was no longer about the company's future. It was about Tom Grayson, the janitor whose notebook had saved them from disaster. Executives whispered about him in hallways, employees stole glances as he passed, and his name quickly became a quiet legend. But for Tom, the attention was more of a burden than a blessing. He hadn't stepped forward to be noticed. He'd done it because no one else would. Now his every move was under scrutiny. Tom was summoned to the executive boardroom, a place he'd only ever entered to clean. The CEO, Daniel Wexler, greeted him with a measured smile. Tom, he began, you've proven yourself to be more than we ever imagined. I want to offer you a formal position as a consultant. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A consultant? You've shown you understand this company better than most of my team, Wexler said. We need someone like you to keep us grounded, to make sure we don't miss what's right in front of us. Tom frowned. And when the shine wears off? When it's not convenient for the janitor to be the one fixing things? Wexler hesitated, clearly taken aback. This isn't about convenience. It's about results. Tom leaned forward, his tone firm but calm. With all due respect, I've seen what happens when people like me speak up. It's fine when it works, but as soon as it gets uncomfortable, we're back to being invisible. The room was silent for a moment before Wexler nodded slowly. If you change your mind, the door's open. Rachel confronted Tom later that day, disbelief written across her face. Why would you turn them down? You've been handed an opportunity most people would kill for. Tom sighed, leaning against his cart. You think they really want me in that room? Or do they just want to put me in a box where they can control the narrative? Rachel crossed her arms. You're cynical, you know that. Tom smiled faintly. No, I'm realistic. But don't worry, I'll still be here, watching, writing, and cleaning up the messes they pretend not to see. While Tom returned to his janitor duties, the ripple effects of his actions began to spread across Echelon. Employees started leaving anonymous suggestions and ideas in drop boxes around the office, inspired by Tom's bravery. Junior staff members began approaching him directly, asking for advice or sharing their frustrations about inefficiencies. Tom listened, jotting down notes in his ever-present notebook. Rachel, emboldened by Tom's insights, started championing transparency and accountability in her team, earning both admiration and resistance from her peers. Tom's influence began to reshape the company culture, even without a formal title. Executives started implementing some of his ideas like cross-departmental collaborations and streamlined workflows. The changes improved morale and productivity, but they also highlighted deeper problems that couldn't be fixed overnight. One evening, as Tom mopped the executive floor, he noticed a crumpled piece of paper near the CEO's office. He picked it up, smoothing it out to find a hastily scribbled note. Reevaluate Q4 projections. Notify Tom? Tom's brow furrowed. It wasn't a formal request, it was almost a question. Were they really starting to trust him? Or was this another test? The months that followed brought change, not the sweeping, dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the slow, quiet kind that reshapes the foundation of an organization. Tom's actions had planted a seed, and though he remained in the shadows, the ripples he created continued to spread. Small but significant changes began taking root within the company. Anonymous Idea Box. Inspired by Tom's story, Echelon introduced an anonymous suggestion platform, encouraging every employee to share insights and solutions without fear of judgment. Increased transparency. Rachel spearheaded initiatives to make internal processes more transparent, fostering collaboration between departments that had once been siloed. Recognition of unseen voices. Quarterly meetings now featured contributions from staff across all levels, including custodial and administrative teams. Tom watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He hadn't taken the consulting role, but he didn't need a title to make a difference. He continued to observe, to listen, and to write in his notebook. One evening, Rachel found Tom in the break room, scribbling in his notebook. She placed a coffee cup on the table and slid into the seat across from him. You know, she began, people are starting to notice the changes around here. They're saying the culture feels better. Tom looked up, his expression calm but curious. And, and I know you don't want the spotlight, Rachel said, leaning forward, but we need someone to keep us on track. Someone who isn't afraid to tell us when we're screwing up. Tom shook his head with a small smile. I told you, I'm fine where I am. Rachel sighed. You're impossible, he chuckled. I'm practical. Besides, you're doing fine without me in the boardroom. Just keep listening. That's all anyone needs to do. One afternoon, Tom was mopping a hallway when a young intern approached him, holding a notebook of their own. Hi, Mr. Grayson, they said nervously. I wanted to ask if you'd look at this. It's some ideas I've been working on and, well, people say you're the person to talk to. Tom raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased. He took the notebook and flipped through it, nodding as he read. This is good, he said. Really good. Keep at it. The intern beamed. Thank you. I will. As the intern walked away, Tom looked down at his own notebook, now filled with years of observations, ideas, and solutions. He realized that what he'd started wasn't just about fixing the company. It was about creating a culture where every voice mattered. In the closing moments, Tom is seen cleaning an empty conference room late at night. On the table is a fresh stack of reports with neatly printed notes in the margins. His notes. He glances at them, a faint smile crossing his face before returning to his cart. As he leaves, the camera lingers on his notebook, resting open to a page with one final entry. A quiet voice can create the loudest ripple. Sometimes the greatest insights come from the quietest voices. This story reminds us that no matter where we stand in life, our actions and ideas can create ripples that change the world. Thank you for watching and for believing in the power of unseen potential. What will your ripple be? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you make a difference.